A dark alley. The air is thick with the chill of the city night, damp, filled with the distant hum of traffic and the occasional shout echoing from the streets. There, under the shadows, a man crouches, his back against the cold, crumbling wall of an abandoned underpass. He's bundled in layers that look worn and thin, a tattered hat pulled low over his eyes, concealing his face. To most passers-by, he's invisible, another forgotten soul lost to the streets, just part of the backdrop of a city too busy to care. Then, footsteps. Purposeful. Heavy. A uniformed officer steps into the alley, his flashlight beam cutting through the shadows, catching the man's slumped figure. He pauses, his eyes narrowing as he takes in the scene before him, a man alone, vulnerable, powerless. In that moment, the officer's expression twists, a small, cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Hey, you," he barks, voice dripping with disdain, "thought this was your territory now, huh? Think you can just rot away here, making this place look like garbage?" The man looks up, eyes wary but calm, saying nothing. He meets the officer's gaze, steady and unflinching, and that only seems to fuel the officer's contempt. "What? You got something to say?" The officer steps closer, towering over him, the badge on his chest gleaming under the weak alley light, a symbol of authority twisted by prejudice. "I should be out there keeping the peace, making sure good people feel safe. But instead, I'm stuck cleaning up scum like you." He sneers, his words a weapon, aimed and cutting. "Guess you're just lucky someone's even giving you the time of day." The man remains silent, his expression impassive, almost as if he studied the officer's every move before. That unnerves the cop, the calmness, the lack of fear. He leans in closer, using his size, his uniform, every ounce of power to intimidate. "You're nothing but trash. And I don't need trash cluttering up this city." Then, in one swift movement, the officer swings his arm, a hard, heavy punch connecting with the man's jaw, the sound of impact reverberating in the alley. The man stumbles but catches himself, a flicker of pain flashing across his face. But when he straightens, his gaze is steely, resolute. He isn't afraid. "What? Not gonna fight back?" the officer taunts, his voice a mockery of pity. "You're pathetic." The man inhales deeply, a sharp breath that seems to ground him. And then, for the first time, he speaks, his voice quiet, controlled, but carrying a weight that the officer doesn't yet understand. "You think you know who I am, don't you?" The officer smirks. "I know exactly who you are. Just another bum wasting space. And I'm here to remind you of it." A pause hangs in the air, tense, electric. The man looks up, his face now visible under the flickering streetlight, his gaze piercing, a look that speaks of strength, of unyielding resilience. "You really have no idea," he says, his tone shifting, laced with something that stops the officer cold. "No idea at all." The officer chuckles, dismissing the tone as bravado. "Oh, yeah. What are you gonna do? Report me? As if anyone would listen to you. People like you don't have power. And if you don't learn that, I'll be glad to teach you." A silence. For the first time, there's a flicker of doubt in the officer's eyes as he registers the subtle change in the man's stance, the way he holds himself, not as a victim but as someone waiting, observing, almost, calculating. "You don't have any clue who you're dealing with," the man murmurs, a slight, knowing smile now tugging at his lips. "But you will." The officer's sneer falters. He looks at the man more closely, searching for the fear that's supposed to be there, but finding none. The man's gaze is sharp, unyielding, like he's been through storms this officer couldn't even imagine. It's unsettling. For the first time, the officer feels something that resembles caution. "What, who are you?" he demands, his voice laced with a sudden, brittle edge. But the man only meets his gaze, unblinking, a quiet confidence settling over him. "I'm here on business," he says, his tone steady, almost calm. "And it turns out, you're exactly the type I'm here to deal with." The officer stares, confusion now mingling with a dawning realization. "Business?" he echoes, almost as if trying to convince himself this man is still nothing more than a vagrant. "You're lying." "You'll see soon enough," the man replies smoothly, his voice level, unshakable. "You see, people like you think you own this city. Think you can abuse your power and get away with it, because who would believe a man like me, right?" The officer's face darkens, a flicker of rage sparking in his eyes. "I don't need to listen to your nonsense," he snaps. "You're nobody. Just another bum I'll make sure doesn't see the light of day." But the man's gaze only hardens, his calm, steely resolve cutting through the officer's bravado. "You think I'm nobody," he murmurs. "But tonight, you're going to find out just how wrong you are. You're going to learn what it feels like to face the consequences." The officer stiffens, a chill creeping over him as he looks into the man's eyes and sees something he didn't expect: power, the kind of power that doesn't need a uniform or a badge to back it up. It's the kind of power that comes from knowing, from watching, from waiting. The officer tries to shake it off, a scoff escaping his lips. "Oh, really? And just what consequences are those?" he sneers, though the edge in his voice has dulled. The man leans forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that's somehow louder than any shout. "The kind of consequences that people like you think don't exist. But tonight, you're going to find out. Because you're not dealing with a homeless man. You're dealing with someone who's been watching you for a long time." The officer's face pales slightly, his confidence wavering. "You're bluffing. You're just trying to scare me." But there's no fear in the man's eyes, only a deep, unyielding determination. He straightens, brushing off his jacket as if it holds more dignity than the officer's entire uniform. "Am I?" he asks quietly. "Then why do you look afraid?" The officer swallows hard, his bravado now barely hanging on by a thread. He's beginning to understand that there's something he's missing, something crucial about this man that he can't quite put his finger on. For the first time, he feels as though the power he thought he held might be slipping from his grasp. As the man watches him, a calm, almost chilling smile spreads across his face. "You thought you could break me," he says, his voice steady, unwavering. "But you're about to find out that I'm not the one who's broken here." A silence stretches between them, thick with tension, charged with an energy that the officer can't seem to shake. For the first time, he feels as though he's standing on uncertain ground, his authority slipping away with every passing second. Who are you?" the officer finally stammers, his voice barely a whisper, the question heavy with the weight of fear. The man tilts his head, his eyes narrowing, as though he's savoring the moment. "Let's just say," he murmurs, "I'm someone who's here to make sure you answer for everything you've done." The officer opens his mouth to retort, but the words die in his throat as the full impact of the man's words begins to sink in. His face drains of color, his confidence crumbling as he realizes that he might just be standing in the presence of someone far more powerful than he ever imagined. And as the man turns, his gaze lingering on the officer with a look of quiet satisfaction, he lets a single sentence hang in the air, a promise that sends a chill down the officer's spine. "You thought you'd walk away from this untouched," he says, his voice low, measured, each word carrying the weight of impending justice. "But tonight, you'll learn that even the shadows have eyes." The officer stares, paralyzed, as the man steps back, his calm presence almost ghostly in the dim light. And as the figure fades into the night, one question lingers in the officer's mind, a question that gnaws at him, burning a hole in his confidence. Just who is this man, and what kind of justice is he about to face? Hello, viewer. Here at Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. We believe in creating stories that reveal the strength, dignity, and resilience in each person, especially those who have faced unfair treatment. Our goal is to shed light on these issues and support a world where respect and equality are upheld for everyone. Enjoy this story, and if it resonates with you, please subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives. Thank you for being here, and now, let's dive into a tale of justice and redemption. The night settled over the city in a blanket of muted lights and murmuring traffic, a stark contrast to the bright, bustling days that defined its downtown. Among the cracks of this urban jungle, down a shadowed underpass where the hum of the highway above filled the silence, a lone figure found his place among the city's forgotten corners. His name was Darius Carter, a man who, to most passing glances, seemed just another person down on his luck. His clothes were layered and worn, hands rough from exposure, with a hood drawn low over his face, making him appear as unassuming as any other transient who might drift through the edges of society. To the untrained eye, Darius blended in perfectly. He sat against the graffiti-covered wall, looking every bit as weary as the abandoned underpass itself. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes, those who caught a glimpse of them might note a subtle intensity, a quiet alertness that betrayed his true purpose. Darius wasn't what he seemed. Beneath the rough exterior, he was far more than a man scraping by on the streets. He was an agent with the FBI, deeply embedded, in search of evidence against a series of racially motivated abuses that had been haunting the city's police department for years. Darius wasn't new to this kind of work. He had been trained to observe, to understand the patterns and behaviors of those around him, to disappear into a role so completely that even he sometimes felt like a ghost among the people he was meant to protect. But this assignment was different, personal. Darius had witnessed injustice his whole life, growing up in neighborhoods where the law seemed to bend harshly over people who looked like him. He'd joined the bureau not just to serve, but to right those wrongs, to be the hand that could deliver justice where it was so often denied. This mission had been months in the making, a meticulous investigation that required him to live on the fringes of society, slipping in and out of locations known to be hotspots for police crackdowns, carefully noting every incident, every raised voice, every encounter that turned hostile. And tonight was supposed to be like any other, just a night to observe, to exist quietly in the background, gathering information. But tonight wasn't just any night. Darius knew there was a heightened risk in the air. The local precinct had been alerted to a surge in homeless activity in the area, and officers were on increased patrol, sweeping through the back alleys and underpasses, cleaning up their city. He had expected a few interactions, maybe a confrontation, but he was prepared to play his part and avoid detection. He didn't anticipate what the night had in store for him. Just as he was settling into his position, he heard the faint crunch of gravel underfoot. The sound was deliberate, steady, and it grew louder until it became clear it was heading his way. Darius didn't move, maintaining his hunched posture as he adjusted his hood to keep his face hidden. But even with his gaze averted, he could sense the figure approaching, feel the authoritative air that seemed to permeate his space before the man even spoke. The officer's name was Officer Ryan Brooks, and he wasn't new to this beat. Brooks had been on the force for over a decade, known to many as a strict enforcer, though others would call him something else, abrasive, hot-headed, a man who took a particular pleasure in asserting his authority in the grittier parts of town. Tonight, he had volunteered to patrol the problem areas, and he came equipped with a sense of purpose that bordered on zealous. Brooks saw himself as the thin line that kept his city clean, his sense of duty twisted by his deep-seated belief that people who didn't fit into his view of society didn't deserve the same respect he'd show anyone else. Officer Brooks noticed Darius immediately. To him, Darius wasn't a person, not in the true sense. He was an obstacle, an inconvenience, something that polluted the pristine image he wished the city would uphold. Without hesitation, he shone his flashlight directly in Darius's face, the harsh light blinding and invasive, illuminating every line and shadow on Darius's face. Darius raised his hand to shield his eyes, instinctively looking away. "What do we have here?" Brooks said, his voice carrying an undertone of disdain. "Thought we'd cleaned out this area. Seems like there's always one more cockroach that slips through the cracks." Darius kept his gaze low, responding just as he'd practiced countless times before, his voice soft and unassuming. "I'm not bothering anyone, officer. Just passing through." Brooks scoffed, stepping closer, looming over Darius with a sneer. "Passing through? Is that what you call it? You people think you can just set up shop wherever you want, take over places decent folks need to walk through. Darius bit back a response, sensing the simmering hostility in Brooks's voice, knowing that anything he said would only provoke further confrontation. But the silence seemed to irritate Brooks even more. The officer took a step closer, his boots stopping mere inches from Darius's hands. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Brooks demanded, his tone sharp. Slowly, Darius looked up, keeping his expression neutral, his gaze steady but non-threatening. He'd encountered men like Brooks before, men who wielded power like a weapon, eager to exert it whenever they felt their authority challenged. Darius's silence, his calmness, only seemed to inflame Brooks further. Brooks sneered, his voice dropping to a cruel, mocking tone. "What, too proud to answer a simple question? You think you're better than me, sitting here like some silent saint? You're just another waste of space, leeching off the system, making this city look bad." Darius clenched his jaw, suppressing the surge of anger rising within him. Every word Brooks spat felt like a calculated strike, a deliberate attempt to strip away any semblance of dignity. He could feel the weight of the words, each one designed to make him feel small, insignificant. But Darius held his ground, his eyes never wavering as he stared back at the officer, letting his silence speak for him. Brooks took another step forward, his hand twitching at his side, fingers brushing against his baton. "You think I won't do it, don't you?" he sneered, his voice low and menacing. "You think I'm afraid to get my hands dirty? I know your type, too lazy to do anything for yourself, expecting everyone else to pick up the slack." Darius felt the rage building, a steady burn that he had long learned to contain. But he couldn't deny the sting of each word, the way it chipped away at the armor he'd built over years of enduring similar encounters. He reminded himself of his mission, of the reason he was here, of the fact that revealing himself now would jeopardize months of work. But standing here, facing the raw hatred in Brooks's eyes, it took every ounce of restraint he had not to break his cover. And then Brooks did the unthinkable. With a quick, brutal motion, he raised his fist and struck Darius across the face, the blow landing with a sickening thud. Darius stumbled, catching himself against the wall, his vision blurring momentarily from the impact. He tasted blood, felt the sharp sting radiate through his jaw, but still, he held his ground, refusing to let Brooks see any sign of weakness. Brooks smirked, watching Darius with a twisted satisfaction. "That's what I thought," he muttered. "Pathetic. Just like all the rest." Darius straightened, his eyes meeting Brooks's once more, a quiet defiance flickering in his gaze. But he said nothing, allowing the silence to speak for him, letting Brooks see that no amount of physical force would ever truly break him. And perhaps, in that silence, there was something unsettling, a glimmer of strength, a sense of unbreakable resolve that made Brooks falter, if only for a brief second. But Brooks quickly dismissed it, turning away with a dismissive snort. "Stay out of sight, or next time, I won't be so gentle," he spat, tossing the words over his shoulder as he strode away, leaving Darius alone once more. As the echoes of Brooks's footsteps faded into the night, Darius remained still, the throbbing pain in his jaw a stark reminder of the encounter, a bruise not only to his face but to his dignity. Yet, despite the physical pain, he felt something else, a deep, simmering resolve, a determination that solidified within him, stronger than any blow. Darius had been patient, methodical, careful in his approach. But tonight had shifted something within him. He had felt the sting of humiliation, the weight of prejudice bearing down on him, and he knew that the time would soon come for reckoning. For too long, men like Brooks had gone unchecked, their power unchallenged, their actions left in the shadows. But not tonight. As he stood in the quiet of the underpass, Darius felt a new sense of purpose settle over him, a calm, unshakable certainty that justice would prevail. The city lights flickered in the distance, a reminder of the world that lay just beyond, unaware of the darkness that festered in its own heart. But Darius was here to shine a light, to bring justice to those who had long been denied it. And tonight, he knew, was only the beginning. The days following that encounter with Officer Brooks were marked by a tense silence that hung heavily over Darius, like the quiet before a storm. Every night, he would return to his spot under the underpass, bruised jaw aching, every glance at his reflection in the cracked mirror of a nearby restroom reminding him of the officer's contempt and brutality. But it wasn't the pain that lingered, it was the look in Brooks's eyes, that cold certainty that he would get away with it. That confidence in his own impunity. For men like Brooks, people like Darius were invisible. He was only a target for their unchecked authority, not someone who might fight back. But Darius was anything but a target. Each night, he resumed his role, but his purpose grew sharper, more personal. He wasn't just watching anymore, he was waiting. Each encounter with the city's officers, each hushed conversation he overheard, every sidelong glance cast his way, he absorbed it all, piecing together a web of corruption that was more insidious and entrenched than he had even anticipated. One evening, as Darius took his usual position, he heard footsteps approaching. He tensed, ready to disappear into the shadows if it was Brooks or one of his colleagues. But this time, it was someone else. A young woman, barely out of her teens, her frame thin and her eyes sunken. She looked scared, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds, clearly running from something. "Hey," she whispered as she spotted Darius, her voice trembling. Can I sit here with you? Just for a minute?" Darius gestured to the spot beside him, his eyes scanning the dark street for any sign of trouble. "Of course," he said, keeping his tone calm. "What's going on?" The girl exhaled, clutching a torn bag close to her chest. They kicked me out of the shelter again. Cops said I was causing trouble, but I didn't do anything. They just wanted me out of there. Said people like me don't belong in this part of town." Darius clenched his fists, the familiar anger rising within him. He had seen this too many times, people cast out, mistreated simply for existing in the wrong place, for not fitting into the mold the officers wanted to see. "They have no right to treat you like that," he replied, his voice steady. "You deserve a place to be safe." The girl looked at him, her gaze filled with a desperate hope. "You really think so?" she asked. "Because I don't know if anyone else does." Darius nodded, his resolve hardening. "I know so. And I promise, change is coming. They won't get away with this forever." As the girl left, Darius felt the weight of his responsibility grow. This wasn't just about him, it was about everyone who'd been cast aside, dismissed, or brutalized by the people sworn to protect them. Each encounter fueled his drive, steeling him for what he knew he had to do. The time for patience was drawing to an end. The next night, Officer Brooks returned to Darius's territory. The look on his face as he approached Darius was one of smug satisfaction, as if he had been anticipating this encounter, savoring the chance to assert his authority once more. "Well, look who's back," Brooks sneered, his hand resting casually on his baton. "Guess some people don't learn their lesson." Darius met Brooks's gaze, calm and unflinching. "Seems like you've been spending a lot of time around here," he said, his voice measured. "Almost like you're looking for something." Brooks laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "I'm looking to keep the streets clean," he replied, stepping closer. "And that means getting rid of troublemakers like you." "Troublemakers?" Darius raised an eyebrow. "All I've been doing is minding my business." "Isn't that what you told me to do?" Brooks's expression darkened. "Don't get smart with me. You think I don't know your type? Acting all innocent, pretending you're not a problem." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "You think you're special? Think you're above the law?" Darius held Brooks's gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "I think the law is supposed to be fair. And I think it's supposed to protect people, not hurt them." Brooks smirked, clearly unimpressed. "You don't know anything about the law," he snapped. "And people like you don't get to decide what's fair." "I do." Darius's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm, to play his role. People like me? He asked quietly. You mean people who don't fit your idea of who belongs here? Brooks's smirk widened. Exactly. People who think they can just sit around, taking up space, causing trouble, when they don't contribute anything to society. People who don't know their place. The words hung heavily in the air, each one a deliberate insult, an attempt to strip Darius of his dignity. But instead of feeling defeated, Darius felt his resolve strengthen. He let the silence stretch, allowing Brooks to revel in his imagined victory, while he silently prepared for the moment when he could finally reveal the truth. As the days passed, Brooks continued his routine, patrolling the underpass, each encounter with Darius more confrontational than the last. Darius had become his target, a symbol of everything Brooks despised, and he seemed determined to break him, to exert his dominance through humiliation and intimidation. But Darius remained steadfast, enduring each encounter, knowing that his patience would soon pay off. One evening, as Brooks approached, he was accompanied by another officer, Officer James Miller, a younger, more impressionable cop who seemed eager to follow Brooks's lead. Darius observed them from a distance, noticing the way Miller watched Brooks, the way he absorbed every word, every gesture, like a student learning from a mentor. As they neared, Brooks gestured towards Darius, his voice loud and mocking. See this guy, Miller? He's the perfect example of what's wrong with this city. Thinks he can just sit around, acting all high and mighty, like he's better than everyone else. Miller glanced at Darius, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. But, isn't he just sitting there? I mean, he doesn't seem to be doing anything wrong. Brooks scoffed, shaking his head. That's where you're wrong. People like him are the reason this place is going downhill. If we let them stay, they'll bring the whole city down with them. You have to be tough, show them who's in charge, or they'll walk all over you. Miller nodded slowly, though he still looked uneasy. Darius watched the exchange, a mixture of pity and frustration filling him. He could see how easily young officers like Miller were influenced, molded by men like Brooks, taught to see certain people as threats, as problems to be dealt with rather than human beings with rights and dignity. Is that really what you believe? Darius asked, his voice calm but carrying an edge of challenge. That some people don't deserve the same respect as others? Brooks sneered, stepping forward. What I believe is that some people earn respect, and others, like you, don't. Respect is for people who work, who contribute, not for freeloaders who just take up space. Darius's gaze hardened, a quiet defiance in his expression. And you think you get to decide who deserves respect? Brooks laughed, the sound harsh and dismissive. I don't just think it, I know it. That's what this badge is for. It means I'm in control, that I have the power to keep this city safe. Darius held Brooks's gaze, his voice steady. Power isn't the same as respect. And one day, you're going to find out that the two aren't as interchangeable as you think. Brooks scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. Save your lectures. People like you always think they're so wise, so enlightened, but when it comes down to it, you're just as helpless as the rest. Darius didn't respond, letting Brooks's words settle in the air. He could see Miller watching the exchange, a flicker of doubt in his expression, as if he was beginning to question the things Brooks had taught him. But Darius knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to change minds. Brooks's arrogance, his sense of invincibility, would only be shattered by one thing, the truth. As the officers finally turned to leave, Darius allowed himself a small, knowing smile. The time was drawing near. Brooks had built his power on fear and intimidation, but soon, he would face the consequences of his actions. Darius had gathered all the information he needed, piecing together a web of corruption that extended far beyond Brooks's petty abuses. He had waited long enough, and now, the moment for action was approaching. As Darius sat alone in the underpass, a quiet determination settled over him. He thought of the people he had encountered, the lives affected by men like Brooks, people who had been silenced, dismissed, stripped of their dignity. He thought of the young woman who had sought shelter by his side, her face a haunting reminder of the countless others who had suffered in silence. The air was thick with tension, the kind of tension that fills the silence before a storm. Darius could feel it building, a sense of impending justice that sent a shiver down his spine. He knew that soon, the truth would come to light, that Brooks would be forced to confront the reality of his actions. And in that moment, Darius felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that his patience, his endurance, would soon be rewarded. The stage was set, the pieces in place. All that remained was the final confrontation, a reckoning that would leave Brooks, and everyone else, facing the truth they had so long denied. But as he prepared for what was to come, Darius couldn't shake the feeling that there was more at stake than even he had realized. He knew that the next encounter would be different, that it would mark the beginning of a change far greater than he could have anticipated. And as the shadows deepened around him, Darius waited, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and resolve. The time had come to reveal the truth, to bring justice not only for himself, but for everyone who had been silenced, dismissed, and mistreated. The only question that remained was how Brooks would react when he finally came face to face with the reality he had so long avoided. And Darius couldn't wait to find out. Under the dim glow of streetlights and the distant hum of traffic, the night had an eerie stillness that seemed to vibrate with anticipation. Darius sat on the cold ground of the underpass, his back against the wall, his eyes fixed on the street ahead, waiting. Tonight, everything was in place. The tension of months spent in the shadows, enduring the disdain, the insults, the indignity, all of it would culminate now. He'd been waiting, gathering evidence, preparing for this moment when the truth would come to light, when Officer Brooks would be forced to confront the reality of his actions. The footsteps echoed down the alleyway, slow and deliberate, and Darius didn't need to look up to know it was Brooks. That familiar swagger, the sharp, clicking sound of his boots on the gravel, every step radiated authority, and every step drove home the officer's belief in his own invincibility. But tonight, something was different. There was a kind of gravity in Brooks's approach, an air of finality that suggested he was here not just to intimidate, but to finish whatever twisted game he believed he was playing. Brooks stopped a few feet away from Darius, crossing his arms, a smug smile already forming on his lips as he looked down at him, seeing only a man defeated, a man without power. But tonight, that would change. Well, Brooks said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Still hanging around, huh? I thought by now you'd have learned your place. Darius didn't move, his gaze steady as he looked up at Brooks. Seems like you haven't learned yours either, he replied calmly, his voice carrying a hint of something that made Brooks falter, if only for a brief second. Brooks sneered, shaking his head. You really don't get it, do you? People like you don't get to tell me what to do. I'm the law here. You're just nothing. Darius stood slowly, brushing the dust off his coat, his movements measured. He took a step forward, his gaze never leaving Brooks's. The law, he asked, a quiet challenge in his tone. Or just a man who thinks he's above it? Brooks's face darkened, his hand instinctively moving to the baton at his side. You're treading dangerous ground, you know that. His voice was low, a warning that carried a palpable edge. People who cross me don't usually get a second chance. Darius held his gaze, unflinching. Maybe it's time someone crossed you, then. Maybe it's time someone reminded you that the badge you wear isn't a license to treat people like they're beneath you. Brooks's expression twisted into a mocking smile. You think you're some kind of hero, he sneered, stepping closer until there was barely any space between them. You're nothing but a washed-up bum. No one's coming to save you. No one cares what happens to you. Darius let the silence stretch, allowing Brooks to revel in his perceived power, the confidence that had allowed him to operate unchecked for so long. Then, with a calm, steady voice, he said, "That's where you're wrong." Brooks's smile faltered, a flicker of confusion passing over his face. "Excuse me," he demanded, his voice tinged with a hint of uncertainty. Darius took a step back, his stance relaxed, but his eyes held a fierce determination. "You don't know who I am, do you?" he asked, his voice calm yet carrying a weight that made Brooks hesitate. Brooks scoffed, rolling his eyes. "You're just another lowlife, wasting space in my city. That's all I need to know." Darius's gaze hardened, and his next words were delivered with a quiet intensity that stopped Brooks in his tracks. "My name is Darius Carter," he said, his voice firm. "And I'm an agent with the FBI." Brooks froze, his face blanching, the confidence draining from his expression as the reality of Darius's words began to sink in. "You're lying," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper, the words filled with disbelief. Darius shook his head, a calm smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You wish I were," he replied. "But I've been watching you, Officer Brooks. I've been watching everything. Every step you've taken, every word you've spoken, every line you've crossed." His voice was steady, controlled, each word carrying the weight of months of preparation, of patience, of righteous anger. Brooks's face twisted in a mixture of shock and rage, his hands clenching into fists. This is a joke," he spat, his voice shaking. "You expect me to believe this? Some bum on the street thinks he can just pretend to be an FBI agent and scare me?" Darius reached into his coat, pulling out a small badge and holding it up, the silver glint of the FBI insignia catching the dim streetlight. Brooks stared at it, his face paling as he realized the truth. His breath hitched, his bravado crumbling as the reality of his situation began to dawn on him. "This is a setup," Brooks hissed, his voice barely holding on to the last shreds of his confidence. You can't do this. You don't have any right." Darius's gaze was cold, unyielding. "I have every right. You made it easy, Officer Brooks. All I had to do was watch, to document your every move, your every act of abuse, and let your actions speak for themselves." He took a step forward, his voice growing softer, more dangerous. "And tonight, it's over." Brooks's mouth opened and closed as he struggled to form words, the shock and disbelief warring with the anger that had fueled him for so long. "You think you're going to bring me down?" he sneered, his voice wavering. "You think anyone's going to believe you?" Darius's expression didn't waver, his voice calm, resolute. "I don't need them to believe me, Brooks. I just need them to see the evidence. And I have all the evidence I need." Brooks took a shaky step back, his confidence unraveling with each passing second. This can't be happening," he whispered, his voice laced with desperation. "Oh, it's happening," Darius replied, his tone steady, controlled. "Every person you've hurt, every life you've impacted, tonight, it all comes back to you." Brooks's hands were shaking now, his eyes darting around as if searching for a way out, for something, anything, that could save him. But there was no escape. Not tonight. Darius took a final step forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried an unmistakable finality. "Your time is up, Officer Brooks. And there's nowhere left to hide." Brooks's face contorted, the rage and fear blending into a look of pure desperation. You can't do this to me," he hissed, his voice barely a whisper, the words filled with a hollow emptiness. "I'm the one in control. I'm the one with the power." Darius's gaze was unyielding, his voice steady. "Not anymore." Brooks stood there, frozen, his world crumbling around him. For years, he had operated under the assumption that he was untouchable, shielded by the authority of his badge and the silence that surrounded his actions. And now, he was face to face with a reality he had never imagined, his every misdeed exposed, his power stripped away by the very man he had tried to humiliate and control. You can't get away with this," Brooks stammered, a hollow desperation seeping into his voice. "You think you're so smart, pretending to be one of them, hiding in plain sight? No one's going to believe some undercover nobody over a cop like me." Darius's gaze didn't falter. He took a slow, deliberate step closer, his expression calm, almost pitying. You think this is about who they'll believe? He asked, his voice carrying a weight that made Brooks flinch. This isn't about belief, Brooks. It's about truth. It's about justice. And tonight, justice is coming for you, whether you're ready for it or not. Brooks's hands twitched at his sides, his eyes darting around as though searching for a way out, some escape from the walls that were closing in on him. His usual confidence was nowhere to be found, replaced by a hollow, gnawing fear that seemed to sink into his very bones. Listen, we can work something out, he said, his voice lower now, almost pleading. I was just doing my job, okay? Sometimes, you have to make tough choices. You know that. You're law enforcement too. You understand, right? Darius's expression remained stony, his voice calm and unyielding. Tough choices. Is that what you call it? He replied, his tone laced with quiet disgust. Beating people down because they don't look like you, humiliating them because you can. That's not making tough choices, Brooks. That's abuse of power. And tonight, it's over. Brooks swallowed hard, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find words, excuses, anything that could salvage his crumbling authority. You don't get it, he whispered, desperation creeping into his voice. These people, they don't respect us. They don't follow the rules. Someone has to teach them. Darius shook his head slowly, his gaze filled with a disappointment that cut deeper than any insult. Teach them? Is that what you tell yourself to justify all of this? He gestured around them, at the darkened street and the city beyond, at the people who had been affected by Brooks's actions, by his so-called lessons. You think fear is the same thing as respect? That you can just beat people down and expect them to fall in line? Brooks's face flushed, his bravado slipping away with each passing second. I did what I had to do. Sometimes, you have to make sacrifices. Sacrifices? Darius's voice hardened, his gaze piercing. The only thing you sacrificed was your integrity. Your duty was to protect and serve, but you turned that duty into a weapon. And now, you're going to face the consequences. Brooks's fists clenched, the last remnants of his defiance flaring up in a final, desperate attempt to regain control. I don't have to listen to this from you, he spat, his voice trembling with anger. You think you're better than me? Just because you've got that badge? You're nothing, just another thug hiding behind a title. Darius's expression remained calm, his voice steady and unwavering. I didn't join the FBI to feel powerful, Brooks. I joined to protect people. People like the ones you've hurt, the ones you've left in the shadows, thinking no one would ever stand up to you. I'm here because someone has to stand up, because someone has to hold you accountable. Brooks let out a bitter laugh, a hollow sound that echoed in the empty street. Accountable? You think they'll care about anything you have to say? The system, it's built for people like me. People who know how to get things done, who know how to keep the streets in line. Darius took another step forward, his gaze never leaving Brooks's face. You're right about one thing, Brooks, he said quietly. The system has protected people like you for too long. But that ends tonight. Brooks's face twisted in anger, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. So what's your plan, huh? You're going to hand in a report, tell your superiors some sob story about how mean old Brooks hurt your feelings? He sneered, though his voice wavered, betraying his fear. It's not going to stick, Carter. You know it, and I know it. Darius shook his head, a quiet smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Oh, I think it'll stick, he replied, his voice calm. You see, I've been gathering evidence. Every encounter, every word you've spoken, every action you thought no one would ever see. And I'm not the only one who's been watching. Brooks's sneer faltered, his bravado giving way to a look of dawning horror. What do you mean? He stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Darius gestured to the shadows behind him, and out of the darkness, a figure emerged, a young woman, her face familiar, her eyes blazing with quiet determination. It was the girl who had come to Darius for help, the one Brooks had thrown out of the shelter, dismissing her as just another nuisance. Brooks's face went pale as he recognized her, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to process what he was seeing. You were watching too?" he whispered, his voice tinged with disbelief. The young woman nodded, her gaze unyielding. "I saw everything," she said, her voice calm but carrying a quiet strength that Brooks hadn't anticipated. "And I'm not the only one. There are others, people you thought you could silence, people you thought would never have a voice." Brooks's hands shook, his defiance crumbling as he realized the magnitude of what was happening. This is a setup," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. You can't do this to me." Darius took a step closer, his voice low and filled with quiet conviction. "No, Brooks. You did this to yourself." The silence stretched, heavy and charged, as Brooks's world crumbled around him. He had spent years building his power on the backs of those he had oppressed, those he had silenced and dismissed. But now, that power had turned against him, and he was left standing alone, exposed, his actions laid bare for all to see. The young woman took a step forward, her gaze steady as she looked Brooks in the eye. "People like you think you can do whatever you want, that no one will ever hold you accountable. But we're done being afraid. We're done being silent." Brooks's face contorted in anger, his voice rising in a final, desperate outburst. "You think this is justice? You think you're making a difference? You're nothing. None of you are anything compared to me." Darius held his ground, his gaze steady, unyielding. "Maybe we're nothing to you, Brooks. But tonight, you're going to find out that even the smallest voices have power." Brooks's face twisted with rage, his hands clenching at his sides as he realized he had nowhere left to run, no way to escape the truth that had finally caught up with him. His power, his authority, everything he had built his identity on, had been stripped away, leaving him exposed, vulnerable, and utterly powerless. Darius took a final step forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried a quiet, unshakable conviction. "Your time is over, Brooks. Tonight, justice is here, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." The words hung in the air, a final, undeniable truth that left Brooks staring at Darius, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. And as the weight of his actions settled on him, he finally understood that his power, his control, his ability to silence others, it had all been an illusion, a facade that had crumbled under the weight of justice. In that moment, Brooks was left standing alone, his authority shattered, his power stripped away, facing the reality he had tried so hard to deny. And as he looked into Darius's eyes, he saw not just a man, but a force of justice, a voice for the voiceless, a reminder that even the smallest acts of courage could bring down the mightiest towers of oppression. As Brooks stood there, surrounded by the weight of his own actions, the reality of his situation sank in like a stone. Every layer of his authority in his carefully crafted image had been stripped away, leaving him exposed, vulnerable, and trapped. He could feel Darius's steady gaze on him, unyielding and resolute, and he couldn't shake the sense that he was facing not just a man but the embodiment of justice itself, a justice that he had thought himself immune to. The young woman who had watched him, who had felt the sting of his abuse firsthand, remained beside Darius, her expression a mixture of defiance and relief. She no longer looked afraid, she looked empowered, as though, for the first time, she had found her voice. And with Darius at her side, she knew she wasn't alone. There was a profound silence in the air, a stillness that hung heavy, pressing down on Brooks as he struggled to find some way out, some last attempt to regain control. But each desperate thought he clung to slipped away like sand through his fingers. For years, he had ruled these streets with an iron fist, confident that his authority would never be questioned, that his actions would never come back to haunt him. But now, the tables had turned, and he was the one standing on the edge, his future hanging by a thread. Darius took a step forward, his calm gaze never wavering as he spoke, his voice low but carrying a weight that Brooks couldn't ignore. "You thought you were invincible, didn't you?" he asked, his tone steady. "You thought you could keep hurting people, tearing them down, and that no one would ever stand up to you." Brooks opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He could feel the eyes of Darius and the young woman on him, their silent judgment burning into him, stripping away the last remnants of his defiance. Darius continued, his voice steady and measured, each word carrying the weight of his resolve. "All these years, you built yourself up, pretending you were protecting this city, keeping it safe. But the truth is, you weren't protecting anyone but yourself. You used your badge as a weapon, turning the people you were sworn to protect into your enemies. And now, you're going to face the consequences." Brooks swallowed, his throat dry as he struggled to maintain his composure. "Consequences," he whispered, barely able to find his voice. You think I deserve this?" Darius nodded, his gaze unyielding. "Yes, Brooks. You deserve every single consequence coming your way. You abused your power, hurt people who couldn't fight back, and never once did you stop to consider the damage you were causing. And now, that damage is coming back to you." Brooks looked away, his jaw clenching as he fought to suppress the growing sense of dread in his chest. He had always seen himself as untouchable, as someone who could control his surroundings, bend the rules to his will. But now, with Darius and the young woman standing before him, he felt small, powerless, a feeling he had spent his entire life trying to avoid. The young woman stepped forward, her voice quiet but filled with a strength that surprised even her. "People like you think you can just decide who's worthy of respect, of safety, of dignity," she said, her tone steady. "But that's not your decision to make. You don't get to play God with people's lives." Brooks flinched, the words hitting him like a physical blow. He looked at her, seeing the pain in her eyes, the scars left by his actions, and for the first time, he felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in years, guilt. He had always seen himself as a necessary force, someone who was simply doing what needed to be done, but now, confronted with the reality of his actions, he couldn't escape the truth. Darius watched Brooks's reaction closely, seeing the cracks in his facade, the hints of remorse flickering in his eyes. But he knew that remorse alone wasn't enough. Brooks had to understand the full weight of what he had done, to face the consequences that he had so long avoided. "There are people out there, Brooks," Darius said quietly, "people who are still suffering because of what you did to them. People who have to live with the fear, the trauma, the scars you left behind. And they deserve justice. They deserve to know that men like you can't get away with this anymore." Brooks looked down, his hands trembling as he tried to process the enormity of his actions. He had never thought about the people he had hurt, had never considered the lasting impact of his choices. In his mind, they had always been obstacles, nuisances, people who needed to be put in their place. But now, confronted with the truth, he could no longer hide behind that justification. What happens now?" Brooks asked, his voice barely a whisper, a hint of desperation creeping into his tone. Darius didn't answer immediately. He let the silence stretch, letting Brooks feel the weight of his own question, the uncertainty of his future hanging over him like a storm cloud. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but there was a hardness to it, a finality that left no room for negotiation. "Now, you answer for what you've done," Darius said, his tone unyielding. "Now, you face the justice you tried so hard to avoid." Brooks's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him as he realized there was no escape, no last-minute reprieve. He was cornered, trapped in a situation of his own making, and for the first time, he understood the fear, the helplessness that he had inflicted on others. The young woman stepped closer, her gaze steady as she looked him in the eye. "You thought you could silence people like me, make us disappear. But you were wrong. We're still here, and we're not going away." Brooks stared at her, a hollow expression in his eyes as he struggled to process her words. The arrogance, the bravado that had once defined him had vanished, leaving him with nothing but the cold, hard truth of his actions. And as he looked at the people standing before him, he felt the weight of their judgment, the weight of the lives he had shattered, the futures he had stolen. Darius took a step back, his gaze unwavering as he watched Brooks grapple with the reality of his situation. He could see the cracks forming, the slow, painful realization that Brooks was beginning to understand the consequences of his actions, that he was finally facing the truth he had spent so long denying. As the silence stretched, Darius spoke, his voice calm but carrying a weight that Brooks couldn't ignore. "This isn't just about punishment, Brooks. It's about accountability. It's about showing people that no one is above the law, that no one can use their power to hurt others without facing the consequences." Brooks's face twisted with a mixture of anger and despair, his hands clenching at his sides as he struggled to contain the emotions swirling inside him. He wanted to fight back, to reclaim his authority, but he knew, deep down, that he was defeated. There was no coming back from this, no way to escape the truth that had finally caught up with him. The young woman watched him, her expression a mixture of pity and defiance. She had spent years living in fear, hiding from people like Brooks, but now, she felt a sense of freedom, a sense of justice that she had never thought possible. And as she looked at him, she knew that his power over her was gone, that he was just a man, flawed and broken, stripped of the authority he had once wielded so recklessly. Darius stepped back, his gaze still fixed on Brooks as he prepared to leave, to let justice take its course. But before he turned away, he spoke one final time, his voice calm but filled with a quiet strength that left no room for doubt. "Remember this moment, Brooks," he said softly. "Remember what it feels like to be powerless, to face the consequences of your actions. Because this is what justice looks like. And it's something you can never escape." Brooks didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the ground as he processed Darius's words, the truth sinking into him like a stone. For the first time, he understood the weight of his actions, the harm he had caused, and he knew that there was no going back, no way to undo the damage he had done. As Darius and the young woman turned to leave, the silence of the alley filled the space between them, a quiet reminder of the justice that had finally been served. And as they walked away, Brooks was left alone, his authority stripped away, his future uncertain, facing the truth that he had spent his entire career trying to avoid. The weight of his actions settled over him like a shadow, a reminder of the lives he had hurt, the power he had abused, and the justice that had finally caught up with him. And in that moment, he understood that his reign of terror was over, that he was no longer the man he had once thought himself to be. For the first time, Brooks was truly alone, his power stripped away, his future shrouded in uncertainty. And as he stood there, surrounded by the silence of his own actions, he understood the true meaning of justice, the kind of justice that doesn't wear a badge, but carries the weight of truth, of accountability, of consequences that no one, not even him, could escape. The days following Brooks's exposure brought a palpable shift throughout the precinct and the city. News of his actions, his abuse of power, and his eventual downfall spread quickly. Darius's meticulous investigation and the evidence he had gathered were presented to higher authorities, leaving no room for Brooks to escape. His misdeeds were laid bare for everyone to see, and his once formidable reputation crumbled, leaving him isolated and disgraced. Brooks was forced to resign, stripped of his badge and the authority he had so long abused. He faced multiple charges, each tied to the people he had hurt, the rights he had trampled, and the lives he had negatively impacted. His desperation for control and the hollow justifications he had told himself became his downfall. The city he once thought he controlled became the backdrop for his humiliation, his arrogance now replaced with an overwhelming sense of regret and powerlessness. The people who had once feared him now watched his disgrace, the man who had tried to silence them brought to justice. As for the young woman, her courage and resilience shone through in the aftermath of Brooks's downfall. For the first time, she felt safe walking through her neighborhood, knowing that someone who had wielded power so recklessly was no longer there to intimidate her or others like her. She became a voice within her community, speaking out against injustices she had once felt powerless to resist. Inspired by her experience and the courage Darius had shown, she began working with local advocacy groups, helping others find their voices, too. No longer a silent observer, she found strength in her story, her trauma transformed into resilience and empowerment. And Darius. Darius returned to the bureau with his mission complete. This assignment had tested him, not just professionally, but personally. He had faced an ugliness he knew all too well, an ugliness he had worked so hard to combat. But now, there was a quiet satisfaction, a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that his efforts had brought a kind of justice to those who needed it most. When he walked back into the FBI office, there was a silent acknowledgement from his colleagues, a nod to the work he'd done, the risks he'd taken. He had gone beyond his call of duty, becoming a hero to a community that needed one. In his heart, Darius knew he had made a difference, that he had given people hope and reminded them that justice was not an illusion but something real and attainable. His superiors recognized the gravity of what he had accomplished. They acknowledged the challenges he had faced, the hostility, and the danger, and offered him another promotion, a path to a higher role within the bureau, one that would allow him to continue his mission on a broader scale. But Darius, though honored, turned down the promotion, choosing instead to stay where he could make the most direct impact, where he could continue to be a presence in the communities that needed change the most. For Darius, this mission had cemented his commitment not only to the Bureau but to his personal mission, to stand against corruption, prejudice, and abuse of power. He knew that his work was far from over, but with each case, each step, he was bringing the justice he'd always sought to the places that had been neglected, the people who had been dismissed. Months later, on a warm evening, Darius found himself back near that familiar underpass. He stood there, looking out at the street, the faint hum of the city a comforting backdrop. The young woman he'd once sheltered beside came over to meet him, her expression one of gratitude and newfound strength. Together, they looked out at the city, feeling a sense of quiet triumph. "We really did it," she said softly, a slight smile on her face. "You kept your word." Darius nodded, a quiet pride filling him. "We did it together," he replied. "And there's still work to be done. But tonight, we celebrate." They stood there in silence, a peaceful moment in a place that had once been the site of intimidation and fear. Now, it felt like a place of hope, a reminder of what could be achieved when people stood together, when voices once silenced found strength. This story reminds us that justice isn't always found in the obvious places. Sometimes, it's hidden, waiting to be uncovered by people willing to step up, to face their fears, and to bring change even when the odds are stacked against them. For those who have experienced injustice, the courage to speak out and seek accountability is a powerful weapon, one that can dismantle even the strongest walls of corruption. Darius's story shows us that power can be a tool for good or for harm, depending on how it's used. Brooks chose to abuse his power, to see himself as untouchable, and in the end, that same power became his undoing. But people like Darius remind us that true strength lies in integrity, in using power to protect and uplift others. What about you? Have you ever felt silenced or ignored, or known someone who has faced injustice? How did it affect you? Sometimes, all it takes is one person standing up, one voice speaking out, to spark change. We'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. How does this story resonate with you? If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of justice, resilience, and unexpected twists, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Let's continue to explore these powerful stories together. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes, the quietest voices hold the greatest strength.